Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill. 3 iconic killers, 3 different movies. But they all trace back to the exact same door. November 1957, Plainfield, Wisconsin. A police officer opens the door of a farmhouse. He expects a missing person. He finds something that takes 4 days to document. In the decades that follow, this case becomes the DNA of American horror. 3 iconic killers, 3 different films, 3 different directors, all of them trace back to the same door. His name was Ed Gein, and the most disturbing thing about him was not what he did. It was that he looked exactly like your neighbor. Ed Gein was born in 1906, but his story begins with his mother, Augusta. She was deeply religious. The outside world, in her view, was corrupt beyond saving. When Ed was 7, she moved the family to an isolated farm outside Plainfield, deliberately, to cut them off from neighbors, from school friendships, from anything she could not control. She controlled every aspect of Ed's life. Women were instruments of evil. Friendships were forbidden. Affection was reserved for Sunday sermons. Ed had no social life, no friends, no relationships outside that house. Developmental psychologists describe this kind of environment with a specific term: enmeshment. It happens when a parent's identity and a child's identity fuse so completely that the child develops no separate self. Think of it like 2 trees growing so close together that their roots fuse. You cannot remove one without killing the other. Ed Gein's roots were entirely fused with his mother. Under normal conditions, a child gradually separates, tests the world, builds their own understanding. Ed Gein never did. In 1944, his brother Henry died in a fire. The circumstances were never fully explained. His father had died years before. In 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke. She died. Ed was 39 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was completely alone, with a self that had been built entirely around one person, who was gone. Psychologists have a term for the objects children use to manage separation. Donald Winnicott, one of the most influential developmental psychologists of the 20th century, called them transitional objects. A blanket, a stuffed animal, something physical that represents the missing attachment while the psyche learns to exist independently. It works because the child's brain is still plastic. Identity is still forming. The object fills a gap while the self catches up. Ed Gein's self never caught up. He sealed Augusta's room, kept it exactly as she left it. Then he started visiting local cemeteries. From 1947 to 1957, a full decade, he exhumed bodies. Not as trophies, not as souvenirs, as transitional objects. His psyche, frozen at the developmental stage of a child who cannot tolerate separation, attempted to solve the unsolvable, to keep the lost attachment physically present. Clinicians later identified this as pathological mourning, a recognized condition in which grief does not move through its normal stages but calcifies instead. The brain refuses to update its model of reality. The person is gone, but the architecture built around them keeps firing as if they are not. In most cases, pathological mourning looks like depression, withdrawal, a person who stops participating in life. In Ed Gein's case, it produced something no clinical framework at the time had anticipated. He also killed 2 confirmed murders: Mary Hogan, a tavern owner, in 1954; Bernice Warden, a hardware store owner, in 1957. The investigation into Warden's disappearance led police to the farm. What they found inside took 4 days to fully document. The scale of what Gein had built over 10 years required additional personnel to process. One officer later said, "No training could have prepared us for what was in that house." Gein was arrested without resistance. He was polite to the officers. He offered them coffee. In 1960, Robert Bloch wrote Psycho. In 1974, Tobe Hooper released The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In 1988, Thomas Harris created Buffalo Bill. 3 writers, 28 years, 1 source. The question is not what they borrowed. The question is why 3 people, independently across 3 decades, kept returning to the same case. Not the violence. True crime offered no shortage of violence. They kept returning to the gap between what Ed Gein appeared to be, a quiet, polite, harmless neighbor, and what was inside his house. That gap is the core mechanism of horror, not the monster, the ordinary face that conceals it. And in Gein's case, the gap did not come from deception. It came from the fact that the mask was all that was ever constructed. Psychiatric evaluations of Ed Gein produced a profile that resisted existing clinical categories. He was not a sadist. No evidence he derived pleasure from pain. He was not predatory in the conventional sense. No sustained stalking, no calculated hunting pattern in the way most serial cases present. What clinicians found was something they struggled to name. A self that had never properly formed, attempting to compensate for a loss it had no architecture to process. Dr. George Arndt, who spent weeks evaluating Gein before his trial, described him as one of the most psychologically unique cases of his career. Not because of the crimes, because of the absence. There was no suppressed guilt, no hidden remorse, no evidence those categories existed anywhere in Gein's internal architecture. He understood the rules. He could recite them. He understood that the officers wanted him to come with them. He simply had no internal experience that corresponded to why. This is what pathological mourning, at its most extreme, actually means. Not wanting someone back, but a self that cannot update, a brain that built every neural pathway it possesses around one relationship, and when that relationship ends, continues running those pathways, because there is nothing else to run. The behaviors that followed Augusta's death were, in the most clinical sense, the outputs of a system with no other program. Most people who lose the central relationship of their lives do not harm anyone. But the psychological collapse that follows, the withdrawal, the self that seems to vanish, the grief that does not move, follows the same underlying mechanism. The difference between ordinary grief and pathological grief is not the intensity of the emotion, it is the structure underneath it. When they finally locked him away, psychiatrists expected to find a raging psychopath, a sadist, a mastermind of evil. Instead, they found a quiet, polite man who spent his days reading the Bible and drawing pictures of his mother. He didn't miss his victims. He didn't miss his freedom. He only missed her. For 27 years in a maximum security psychiatric hospital, Ed Gein wasn't being punished for his crimes. He was simply waiting in the only place left where he couldn't lose her. We turn his story into movies. We put masks on actors and play scary music. But the real horror of Ed Gein isn't in the dark, it's in the daylight. It's the realization that the most terrifying thing a human being can be is completely empty. The monster doesn't hide under the bed. He just sits quietly at the kitchen table, waiting for someone to tell him who he is. Next week, 40 years, 0 suspects, 13 murders, not a witness, not a confession, an algorithm. If this stays with you, you're already thinking like we do. Subscribe to CurioMind and come back. The brain behind crime